Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Canadian Story. I'm happy to have my friend IJ on. Welcome, IJ. Would you want to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's awesome.
Absolutely.
I've been listening to some of your episodes. Who am I? I'm a product designer during the day, and then during my free time, I do a lot of podcasting, and I'm a big martial arts fan, so I do jiu-jitsu and a little bit of Muay Thai. You know, I'm getting into my Muay Thai game, but I just get trashed every time we spar because my stand-up sucks.
But you're pretty good at rolling.
Yeah, I mean, jiu-jitsu I've been doing for about 3 years, so that's like a brief. Designing, martial arts, talking about ideas. Those are the things that I'm into.
I love that. Yes, and I love your podcast. I love your commitment to ideas. You are kind of in that circle of Ottawa people that I admired and was part of when I lived there for a decade. So as you know, on this podcast, every time we try to ask, not every time do we make it, I guess.
Sometimes we forget.
Sometimes we forget. But what do you love about Canada?
That is a great question, because to me, even though I constantly rail against some of the Canadian issues I have with people not speaking up enough, the one thing I do love is the freedom. I'm still in the middle of getting my Canadian citizenship. Like, obviously everything's delayed. So
Yes.
Me having grown up in India, there's that. Coming here, there's so much freedom that every time I think about it, it blows my mind. But, once you kind of get used to freedom, you start to see the little increments in which it gets taken away and you start to speak up. But freedom to me is freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those are the two main things that I'm a huge proponent of. And I've always been a huge proponent of, having grown up in India, having faced religious persecution in my family. So those things here, that's what I love about Canada.
That's the gold standard. Tell us a little bit about the transition from India to Canada, what it was like. You got to see Canada with eyes that a lot of people who are born here don't, right? Because you got something to compare it to, where a lot of people who live here don't have anything really. They don't even travel that much. So they don't have that much to compare it to. So maybe you can share some of your experience with our listeners on what it's like to go through that transition and what it kind of taught you.
And the transition was something that I sort of expected, because I have family in the States, and they're Americans, and you growing up, you always hear about the freedom in America. If you go to America, you can become whoever you want to become. You can make as much money as you want. You can say whatever you want to say, and nobody's gonna come to your house with a grenade trying to blow you up. So transitioning here, I never really heard about Canada growing up, right? Because the big brother
Right.
America,
Yes,
you always hear about the States. Everything's about the States.
Yep.
So when I came here, I had obviously researched, and I knew, it's essentially you get the same amount of freedom, if I could say it that way.
Yeah.
But the huge difference for me was how you could openly, at least up until very recently that I found, you could openly discuss controversial ideas without having to look behind your back and see if somebody's trying to cancel you or somebody's trying to get you fired from your job. Because in India, there are two things that you can't really, depending on where you live, right? So I grew up in Manipur, which was a majority Hindu state. And so when we were growing up, and my parents were Christian, and my dad was a minister as well. So when we were growing up, there was always people showing up at our house trying to, threaten our family, threaten us as kids, threatening my parents that they're going to kidnap us when we're outside, and
wow,
all sorts of things, like all sorts of crazy things. And then the other side of that was Manipur and Nagaland. Just to give you a terrible, short, brief history, was there's a civil unrest that's been happening since 1953, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh,
It could be
wow.
actually earlier than that. And it's with the Naga people versus the rest of India. And the Naga people have been fighting for freedom from India as they want to be their own nation. And I'm a Naga. I belong to that tribe, but it's so muddy, it's so bloody. Like tons and tons of people have died fighting it, and the one thing you can't really discuss or criticize is the militia. Even saying the militia would get me in trouble, but they're called the NSCN, Naga Socialist Council, something, I forget what it is. So if you criticize them and you're a Naga, then one of two things could happen, right? One, they could show up to your house and beat you up. Two, you could just disappear.
Right.
Right? And so my dad was always more open-minded in criticizing what was bad and praising what was good. And so, there's a story, and there's a story of him. He was in the States. He was doing his doctoral in the States, and he had come back to India, and he had brought back a new pair of shoes. It was the Timberland shoes, right? So this was like in the early late 80s. He comes back, and word gets around that dad has this new shoe from the States, this nice Timberland shoe. So one day he's walking. This is a true story. One day he's walking down in Imphal, in the city that I grew up, town I grew up, and a car pulls up, a Jeep pulls up, and there are five guys in there, and say, "Hey, Ben, it's my dad's name. We heard you have new shoes." He's like, "Yeah." It's like, "Okay, we want them." He's like,
Wow.
"What?" He's like, "I'm not gonna give it to you." They're like, "No, we want them." He's like, "I'm not gonna give it to you." He says, "Well, it's either your shoe or your life."
Wow.
He's like, "Okay, all right, you can take my shoe, of course." So he gives him the shoe. So we have it. So you kind of grow up with this, and then here, I mean, something that reminded me of what it was like in India is in Quebec. You know how they had we had the curfew,
Yes.
right, at like
Yeah.
8 p.m. or something. In Manipur, man, the curfew was essentially my whole life. I remember it was just curfews, right? From 6 p.m., 6 a.m. to like 6 p.m. you could go out, but after that you weren't allowed to go out. So I grew up remembering like it was 6 p.m. It's like 5:59. You're like, "Oh shit, I gotta get home right now."
Wow.
Shit, you gotta get home and go.
Wow.
Your
close the
whole
door.
life.
Well, it's like the majority. I would not the, whole- my whole the majority of my memory is just remembering that we had curfews. So there's just curfews and the curfews happen because of the civil unrest, right? So we would have massive protests, just happening just outside our house, which is on the main street. So and we lived across from a police department, and then on my left hand side would have been a huge army school, army training place. So the civil unrest would always sort of happen in this big street called Chiang Mai Rong Street, which is a street. There's one time, so I come home from school, as I must have been about 9. I come home, and you're growing up, as I was saying, you always look to Hollywood for all your
Right.
knowledge for the U.S. Anything was
Yeah.
So we always grew up with like BB guns, and pretending that we were FBI's. But one day we come home, and I noticed that there were some army cars, jeeps, just parked outside, and we're like, "Oh, whatever." Kind of walk in, go up the stairs, and our house at that point was unbuilt, unfinished. So there's a part where there were window frames with no
Right,
windows,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And there was no roof as well. So like 2 window frames that were unfinished, and then like maybe like a bit bigger than my room with no roof. And I go up, and there's like 6 army guys with like guns. Just 2 of them had their guns perched on the windowsill. And I was like, I come up, and I remember thinking, what is happening here?
Right.
I'm like, go in, and I was like, "Yo, Mom, like, why are there so many army guys here?" And they're like, "Oh, well, they said they wanted to use it, and we couldn't stop them."
Right. Right.
right? So they just barged in and used the windowsill to, whatever protest was happening. And then another time we had these Korean Americans visiting us, and you can only visit India for at least that part that I'm from, the Northeast. You can only visit for about 10 days or for 14 days, right? There's a limitation on tourists visiting that area because it's protected. And so we had these Korean guys visiting. It's a Korean pastor and like his wife and a few of their friends are visiting. So they're visiting. They're at a house, and the civil unrest happens. Right, this huge protest starts taking up. So we're like, okay, you guys have to come inside. It's not safe to be outside there. We're inside the house. So this is the same house, right? That's somehow like 30% unfinished. So we're inside. Our dogs are inside as well. And then the army shows up, and I remember this because we were sort of watching from the top where the army guys had perched their guns before.
Yeah.
So we're there, and it's like these huge protests coming up like this way. So they're coming up this way, and then the army hill, there's armies coming in. And here in the U.S. more recently, rubber bullets have, sort of taken on an. People started discussing about the ethics of rubber bullets and shooting protesters. But back then, this was like, 1990, maybe like 2000. Right? This is like 2000. The Indian Army were using rubber bullets. No shame. There's like, so they show up, and then that's when we realized, oh, this is going to be bad, because it was a ton of army guys showing up, and they just start open firing these rubber bullets on the protesters, and we're watching. And my parents freak out, and they're like, okay, everybody get inside. Obviously, we don't know if, some random ass army guy's going to shoot up on the building. So we all kind of go inside. And then we're from the inside, you can see the street out. And then all you see are these cars show up, and they have tear gas guns or tear gas cannons or whatever they're called. And they just start firing tear gas.
Wow.
This is not good. And they're just open firing, right? Nobody's aiming and nobody's calibrating their shots.
No.
They're just open firing. They open fire, and 3 land inside of our house.
Oh
man, that was like,
wow.
I don't know how old I'm, maybe like 9, 10, maybe. And 3 tear gas falls inside our house, like 2 outside and 1 like on our second on the first floor. So it kind of comes straight up because there's a staircase. It comes straight up, and everybody in the house is crying.
Wow!
Like, oh, this sucks. And these Korean friends of ours who are visiting, first time visiting.
The first
India,
time visiting. Oh
gas,
wow!
Right.
Wow!
So coming here, it's just like a totally different ball game.
Yeah.
There's no real comparison, to the sort of freedom that you have here, where you can essentially discuss anything, talk about anything, disagree for the most part. And, you don't have to fear any of these repercussions.
So you've used some of that freedom to start your own podcast. Why don't you share with our listeners about it? And then I'd like to go into something we haven't talked about on here yet, but like the creative endeavor that is podcasting, and then some of the topics that you've been bringing up on that podcast.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a podcast, Kazingram Dialogue podcast, where essentially we discuss many things that are often not discussed in our contemporary society. So we do a lot of philosophical issues, talk about neuroscience, religion, and obviously the one thing that I love is free speech and freedom. That's like the one thing. The recurring theme of that podcast is essentially that.
Yeah.
And
walk us through why you decided to start the podcast, some of the interesting entrepreneurial challenges of podcasting, and maybe even how you feel about it now.
So the podcast started was twofold reason. One is essentially I wanted to discuss ideas that I felt weren't getting enough attention. When I was in grad school, there were a few things that there's a lot of issues around like free speech that was coming up. There were preferential hiring that was happening at universities, and I got a better understanding because my supervisor in grad school, Mark Mercer, who He's the president for Society for Academic Freedom and Speech. And so Mark was my supervisor. So Mark and I always had these conversations. And he was essentially the guy who inspired me to think that it is possible, one, to have these discussions, and two, there are people in Canada and in academia, even though they're a very small minority from what it seems like, who are willing to have conversations, but also defend those who don't get the most popular light in the public media, right? An example I can think of right now would be that professor from Mount Allison, who was recently fired or dismissed or suspended for her views on her views that Canada is not a systemically racist country. Her coming from Lebanon, and so I wanted to discuss these ideas, and I also wanted to, the name Kazingram means heaven in my language, Tangkul, and so it was sort of these abstract, not necessarily abstract, but being able to have conversations, higher order conversations, and it was also the name of our son. So then it was, technically it's threefold. So those are the reasons why I started the podcast, and it's you. I'm sure you guys have experienced this where you talk about things on it with people, and then you have friends who will in private support the conversations you have, right? But in public will never support you.
Right.
They're sort of fearful that they might lose their job, or if they said something, then somebody could report them. So I was telling a friend of mine recently how, it's not that obviously I'm not like Gadsad or anything, but Gadsad often talks about how he has many friends who will in private support him of the things that he says, of the criticisms that he makes against postmodernity or any of the other things that he talks about. But in public, his colleagues and some of his friends won't actually support him, which he finds frustrating, because if more people knew that there were more people who were in support, then it would in one sense be this cyclical thing where more people then would support, and then more people that have the balls to then talk about it and discuss these things.
Courage is contagious.
Courage is contagious.
Yeah.
Yes. That is one of the biggest things that plagues our society right now, in my opinion. This idea that you can be fired for thinking a certain way, or hunted down by the mob and ridiculed for having a dissenting idea. Why do you think we got here?
So you guys would have to help me on this, because one of the things that I've been criticized for is that I don't understand how Canadian culture was like pre-2010, right?
Sure.
I have friends who say, well, IJ, you kind of came in at the tail end of where people were becoming much nicer. Before pre-2010, people were just assholes, and people were super racist, and people were openly homophobic, openly I forget what the other one is. And so when you came in post 2010, my bad, people were much nicer. So, your criticism that Canadian culture is too nice, or Canadian society doesn't discuss these things and tend to shun people who with dissenting views, that's just misplaced. And, I obviously can't speak about what Canada was like 2010, because obviously I wasn't here, but I don't know how drastically different it would have been 2010, pre-2010. Was it really that, were people really just walking around name calling, using racial slurs all the time? I don't know. I don't, like, in terms of that timeline, I don't actually know.
Well, I think what you said near the beginning is important to highlight, right? What are the cornerstones of what makes Canada the kind of place where we're not worried about people coming to our house and throwing grenades in? And that is that despite our imperfection at doing so, our foundation is freedom of religion and freedom of thought, really.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Western that's kind of the cornerstone of Western civilization. Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, right? Where he says individualism is the only way that the West got to where it is, and individualism is all about freedom. That's the whole point. Being part of a group. So I would say that probably the people that are making these criticisms to you, they have some valid points. I mean, particularly with, I would say, homosexuality and how the treatment of the First Nations and a lot of the things that have happened here. Obviously, there was a lot of problems, but that doesn't mean that the foundation is bad. It just means that it took a lot longer for the foundation to get maybe to this point than maybe certain progressive groups would hope. But it's hard to move people into places they don't understand, right? And we've had that conversation on this podcast too, where it's like most of it is fear of the unknown more than it's malevolence. I think anyway.
You know, there is an important factor in emphasizing. I'm always torn. Like I sort of go back and forth between being a proponent of the common good, you know, and hating it completely.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
But one thing that I think I've concluded so far, I don't think my mind's going to change on this, is the importance of having individual freedom, like you just said, right? The ability to pursue what you desire and pursue the ideas that you have, like that, I think produces a better society than one that restricts the individuals right to free speech or freedom of thought, right? Even for the common good. You know, that's why it's tough to it's really tough for me to be 100%, you know, individual liberty with no restriction and no constraints. But the big caveat is it seems that society is freer than a society that has many or some restrictions. I don't know what the limits are, but it seems that anytime you have a society where, you know, the public good, which is not the same as the common good, but for the time being, I'm just
right. Yeah,
I'm not being a good philosopher by mixing the two here.
Right.
But anytime you have a society where, say in India, you know, we grow up, it's still even the West is still tribalistic in one sense, right? You have parties that you're part of, you have groups that you choose to be part of, but in India and in the East as a whole, you're sort of born into it, right? There's no getting out of that. Is you essentially have to take yourself out,
right?
Physically remove yourself and get out. And you know, there's a lot of, you know, there's cohesion. Of course, there is cohesion because there's a sort of tribalistic commonality. There definitely is cohesion, but I wonder if, you know, is it better to have cohesion over freedom? Me having sort of experienced a little bit, grown up in that compared to here, I would always choose freedom.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I love that. Now, I've been having, since we're on the philosophic take and going into these high-minded conversations, I have a little thought that I've been thinking a lot about that I wanted to bring to you, and maybe we can mull over here together. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of freedom, and there's a lot. I mean, Sam Harris claims that everything is deterministic and there's absolutely no free will. Whereas, you know, others are on the more radical side and saying, you know, we choose everything. Maybe even like our destinies are just simply choices and beliefs that we have. I've been reading a lot of the Stoics, and one of the things I've been paying attention to is this quote by Marcus Aurelius, also laid out very well by T.S. Eliot in The Hollow Man, with this idea between the stimulus and the response lies the choice, right? So when we talk about freedom, I think a lot of people think what we mean is freedom to act in a certain way or freedom to think in a certain way, or freedom to speak in a certain way, and that is all true. Fundamentally, the base freedom that we have, the most important freedom anyone can have, is the freedom of how to choose to respond to the world. And I think that might. I don't want to claim that you solved the Arminian and Calvinist debate by saying something like that, but like, we know that freedom exists. It's just that a lot of people don't act on that freedom. They get the stimulus, they have the emotion, and then they respond to the emotion. They've kind of got it backwards. I just love your thoughts on that. I'm sure you have a depth of thought on that particular topic.
Man, I love that you've been diving deep on the Stoics. You know this.
Yeah, I love them.
I am a huge fan of the Stoics. If you haven't read already, which I'm assuming you probably have read, Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile. Have you read that?
I have it on order. I haven't read it yet, but okay. I know that it's a phenomenal book, and that is kind of my like whole life's mission, is to become that, right? Yeah. To avoid my internal world being so impacted by my external world, which seems to be exactly the problem we have right now with cancel culture and all this. It's people are immediately emotionally responding to stimulus without any sort of choice on why they would do that.
And why they would and and there's a great book as well by Patrick Deneen called Why Liberalism Failed. It's a great book, but in it he sort of talks about the freedom that we in the Latin West have come to. Actually, more specifically, like post Cartesian philosophy, where freedom has been associated with doing whatever doing that which you desire and acting that out. And we've sort of conflated that with a classical understanding of freedom, which is a constraint freedom. And this is why I sort of go back with the common good and thing. And there's so much truth in what Patrick Deneen said. And an example that I always think of is, I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've been doing it for a few years. And one thing you quickly realize when you go in there and you decide to, you spar or you roll with somebody, is if you're untrained, you are free to move your body however you want to move, right?
Right.
Nobody puts a restraint on you when you're sparring with somebody, but against a trained opponent, that trained opponent is also free to move his body however he wants to, but he moves it under certain constraints that he has placed himself, because those are the most efficient way of moving and using leverage. And I think that freedom is in the West, as we speak, the sort of freedom that most people espouse is the form of freedom where you're free to do whatever the hell you want to do. No constraints. I want to do this. I think this. I'm going to go do this. But it is very important to me that one's freedom is always tied to one's discipline of your ultimate end or the ultimate goal that you have for yourself. If your ultimate goal is, I don't know, maybe to live like Solomon did and do whatever you want to do, and then at the end of his life gets to, it's like, I've done all that. I've drank all the wine I wanted to drink. I slept with all the women I wanted to sleep with. This is all meaningless. And then
chasing after the wind.
Yeah, chasing after the wind. So I think the freedom, and it's it is a sort of freedom that you have to constantly work towards, because I don't think in one sense, no man is born free. But obviously, in another sense, I think humans are born free, but
everywhere we're in chains.
Yeah. It is. That is a good quote. Yeah. So my thoughts on freedom is always that it's a huge proponent of it, but insofar as it is constraint is not even the right word. So far as your freedom leads you to you flourishing as a human being, like that is the sort of freedom I'm a huge proponent of. And if that means your freedom to speech and freedom of thought and freedom of religion, that I think that falls under that sort of freedom we want, at least the freedom that I want.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you let's dive into even deeper. What do you think of this idea of that, as T.S. Eliot called it, the shadow between stimulus and response? And how does one cultivate that?
One practical way that I've been doing that is doing something very small, like creating small habits. I've actually found to be tremendously helpful in cultivating cultivating a freedom to allow me to do the things that I actually love to do. So one small habit, which this is like overly overly prescribed,
Right.
and it's for me, it's forcing myself to have a cold shower, like just 1 minute. It's not like massive, it's nothing crazy, but just forcing myself to have a cold shower for a minute every day has had a tremendous effect on me willing to do the things that I actually hate doing, which is having cold
Right.
showers and other things.
Oh, I
Does that
love
make
that.
sense?
Yeah, it makes total sense. So habitually doing the things you don't want, creating habits that force you to do things you don't want to, or let's say stay uncomfortable,
Yeah.
actually is what allows you to have the freedom to not be controlled by the whims of your emotion towards any given activity.
Yeah. I think that's okay. And, and becoming lazy, and any time that I've gone, oh, okay, I don't want to do it, that day I would have gone and eaten something that I know is terrible for me, and I will feel like garbage the next day. But I'm like, I don't do it, and then I go and eat something terrible. And so the going just a bit further, there's a example that a friend of mine gave me, and I'm assuming it's a true story because he told me it's his neighbor. He neighbors a priest, right? And the priest, he told me, once a week, once a week, he will sleep either outside or on his concrete floor.
Right.
And my friend told me that when he asked the priest why he did that, and the priest's response was, "It's so that it reminds me how some people are living in the world." And to me, like that was the priest's reason. But to me, a deeper reason is, it puts him in an uncomfortable zone, which allows him to do things that he knows will be difficult, but he sees the end, and hence is able to just proceed and push through it. The sort of suffering and pain is embedded in human life that I think constantly, you don't want to be a sadist or anything about pain, but it constantly being reminded of that, I think is a good way to is a stepping stone towards becoming anti-fragile, to use Nassim Taleb's term.
Yeah.
Well, Peterson talks about chaos and order and having one foot in each.
Yeah.
And I think routinely exposing yourself to discomfort is a useful tool for building a fortitude to be able to take on more and greater amounts of chaos. And those simple practices strengthen your body, strengthen your soul, strengthen your mind against the chaos that you will obviously encounter in your life. You don't get to walk through your life just willy-nilly, not running into problems. And when you embolden yourself against that discomfort, because discomfort is coming, there's no question about it. When you embolden yourself against that discomfort on a regular basis, you unlock within yourself the ability to counter it gracefully when the storm does come.
Yeah, and there's a Nietzsche's Übermensch is sort of misinterpreted, in my opinion. I mean, the Nazis most definitely misinterpreted that, but his idea of the Übermensch is not, an Übermensch that imposes his will on others and controls them, but it's the idea that the Übermensch is able to impose his own will upon himself, such that he becomes the self-overcoming man. And that idea, I think, to me, like, that idea was quite fundamental in how I viewed how I should approach life. There was a there was a few weeks ago, there was a potential tragedy was avoided, but in that moment when it was happening to me, I thought to myself, because coming up from the hospital, I'm sort of standing in my my kitchen counter, and I'm thinking, man, like what would happen if if my wife does die? What am I going to do? Will I just disappear into the dark and escape from society and never come back out? Live in the bushes, never, just cut off all ties to those things that gave me happiness, but it would remind me of my wife. And as I was on the kitchen, I was sort of reflecting, the idea of the self-overcoming man, the Ubermensch, came to me, and I just started thinking more about it, and I realized, at that moment, I wanted a savior to come and, if it does happen, I wanted somebody to pick me up and hold me and carry me. But I realized, nobody's going to come save me.
No,
if it happens. Nobody's coming, right? It's just me. Of course, I have friends, who can help me, but at the end of the day, it's, when you wake up, it's just you waking up. Nobody's going to wake you up.
You right? We are born alone, and we die alone.
And you die alone. And so, to your point, of seeking discomfort, there is that sense in which it allows you to overcome your will, that sort of your desires that inhibit you from, from achieving the things that you set out to do, or achieving the sort of person you want to become. And that constant discomfort of, mine's obviously in terms of that, the shower. There are tons of other people who do crazier stuff, but that for me, every time I step in, I have the cold shower on. I don't think I had read where people have said, yeah, after about 30 days, you get used to it. Maybe I'm doing it wrong, because I'm still not.
You're not used to it. Yeah,
I'm not used. It's always a shock, and some days the water is even colder than it should be. It's like, wow, this is so cold. But seeking discomfort I've found to be tremendously valuable in the way that I act out and live out. And it's even given me more courage to openly discuss ideas that previously I was like, okay, I can discuss it, but I'll discuss it in a more politically, roundabout way. But what is it in turn allowed me to do is, okay, I can have these discussions with people, with my friends, and if they end up unfriending me, then, well, we're not really friends to begin with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not them respecting your freedom of thought or freedom of anything, right? If suddenly if you're no longer, it's heterodox thinking, right? It's being allowed to think different than the group that freedom is. You don't need freedom if you agree with everyone on everything.
Yeah, I mean, if you agree with everyone with everything, there's nothing really that you.
Yeah,
you're not really
what do you
thinking
stand
for yourself.
for? Yeah,
you're not really thinking for yourself. There's this guy called, if you're like in this world of startup, there's a guy called, I actually I only remember his Instagram, his Twitter handle is Balaji. I don't know if you guys know him, but he's somebody who, has him and his friend Naval Ravikant. They're sort of like in the world, in the tech world, who I look up to because they will openly discuss ideas that is taboo in the tech world, right? The tech world being the overlords and priests of what we say and what we can't say. So, there are people who, I don't know what they're doing in terms of their daily life, but
they're having those discussions.
Yeah.
It's actually one of the things that I admire about Eric Weinstein, even though I don't agree with most of his politics. It doesn't matter because he is more than willing and excited to have those conversations, right?
Yeah.
And
Eric.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say I do love Eric Weins, even though I like yourself. I probably don't. I don't think I agree with the majority of things he says, but I deeply respect him. I mean, I wasn't a big fan of his brother, but I respect his brother too.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I guess the last kind of question that I wanted to ask you is, you're a philosopher, which you didn't really mention at the beginning, but that's kind of your ethos, right? Is that's what you care about most. In your, wandering down the byways and highways of your mind, trying to discover truth, what would you say is the foundational principle that you kind of rely on?
That's like I mean that
It's a
is
big question.
That is a big question.
question. There are definitely two principles. Well, one I think that's one would be the principle of non-contradiction inside of philosophy, which is the idea that A cannot be A and not A at the same time, right? Like a human being cannot be a human being and then a paper at the same time, in the same way, in the same sense. And then the principle of sufficient reason, and I could be butchering the actual definition of it because I don't actually remember the full definition of it, but it's something along the line of something has a reason either internally or so intrinsically or extrinsically to that thing, right? So the thing can generally be explained by something about itself or something around about that. So when it comes to truth, I think there is a discussion to be had in terms of what kind of truth there is. So there's most certainly the idea that truth exists, that itself is a truth. And so, there's at least one truth in the world too now, that there's truth in the world and that there is truth in the world.
Right.
And
Right.
There's two truths.
Yeah.
And so objective truth in that sense, it's sort of a conversation that is more abstract and, in philosophy departments, they always sort of have it. But the problem with academic philosophers, is that they're more often than not detached from reality, in my experience. And my my heuristic for figuring out who's a good academic philosopher, is, do they do hard things in their life outside of philosophy, right? And that means, do they train any sort of martial arts? And it can be like, cheap ass, McDojo martial art where you can like one punch man sort of thing. But, do they do jiu-jitsu, wrestling, any, do they do something hard, or are they farmers? Like, do they live on a farm? Do they grow things? Do they kill their own food? Because that to me is like it's a philosopher who has skin in the game and knows what he's talking about, because he's sort of living out his philosophical dispositions. Because there are a lot of philosophers that I know of, and I'm sure you guys know of too, who are like excellent debaters, excellent at pointing out all the flaws in your arguments, excellent at and making people feel very timid to be around. But then when you get to the practical wisdom of how to live, it's totally empty. And that's why I've become a huge fan of the Stoics. I was never a huge fan of the Stoics prior, while I was doing grad school, because I was just an idiot.
Actually, I want to hear why and what changed.
Well, I mean, what changed was that. So when you're inside of academia, and this is not the case for every single academic philosophy departments or philosophers for that matter. There are great philosophers who are huge Stoic fans, but oftentimes within philosophy departments, the Stoics, because the majority of exposure to Stoicism comes from people reading the Meditation by Marcus Aurelius, right?
Yes.
And Marcus Aurelius is often criticized by academic philosophers, mind you, right, who were not fighting, who hadn't killed,
who weren't emperors,
didn't lead wars.
No.
Criticized him for, he's not really a good Stoic. He misunderstood Seneca or Epictetus or whatever they may say. And so I was, I was sort of brought up in that, and that's how I viewed Stoicism. It's like, oh, it's these guys. They don't really know philosophy.
Right,
But
right.
and you would read excerpts of the Meditation. You read excerpts of Seneca. I mean, you read excerpts of essentially everybody, but you would read these excerpts and think, well, these are who they are, whatever, back then. And especially if you're from the school of analytic philosophy, which is the school that I was trained under. And the difference between analytic philosophy and continental philosophy is the analytic philosophers, or analytic philosophy specifically, started in the UK, like broader UK. Continental is European philosophy. And analytic philosophers, they're very good for getting to the nuances of language and the limits of language. Maybe not the limits of language, but how to understand language and logic. They're very good at that. But they're terrible, absolutely terrible, in my opinion, for when it comes to practical philosophy. And continental philosophy is sort of the opposite to an extent, right? They're absolutely horrendous at logic, absolutely horrendous at making sure that their sentences and their arguments actually make sense to people, and it's enjoyable to read. They definitely don't make it easy for it to read, but they're very good in terms of understanding what it means to be human, to essentially live in this world. It's not to live abstractly in like the Platonic form. To live in this world, you have to interact with people. You have to fight with people. You have to, work on yourself. You have to do all these things that are not, that are not abstract. So, what changed was after we lost our son, I went into a sort of a deep, dark time in my life.
Yes.
And when I started reading, and actually I read meditation for itself.
Yeah.
And that's when I found the practical wisdom inside of that book. And I realized, man, for all these years, I shat on this book. And, this book was essentially what helped me realize that I, in one sense, have to open my mind beyond the analytic training that I had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And which also got me interested into Eastern, very specifically like Chinese philosophy. And there's a book. I'm going to mispronounce. I think it's Kanzu. I can send it to you. But in that, there's a line in there which says, "The way is made by walking in it." And so, I think it's Lao Tzu. The Lao Tzu. I think it's Lao Tzu.
The way
That's Lao
is
Tzu.
made
That's Lao
by
Tzu?
walking.
Yeah,
in
that's the Tao Te Ching.
Yes. So, I was reading when I started reading the analytic of Confucius. It's in the intro. He kind of the philosopher kind of talks about the difference between Eastern and Western philosophy, and that quote was in that. And at least from my understanding, it was the context of that was his student had asked him, what am I supposed to do with my life? How am I supposed to go live? Like, give me some advice. And the response was, the way is made by walking in it. And that has stuck with me ever since. That it's very easy to preach and to talk about how you should live. Like, it's very easy for me to say everybody should go have a cold shower.
Right.
If I wasn't having a cold shower, not taking any of
that
the
would
risks.
not be the way. Exactly.
That's Jordan Valeria's Action Creates Clarity.
Yeah, action creates clarity. Exactly.
Oh. Is that a book?
No, it's one of our podcasts.
Another
guy came
podcast
on.
we did with a man named Jordan Valeria, and he said action creates clarity, and it's kind of the same concept.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check that podcast out.
I love even your tone of voice. You're obviously a podcaster who is very reflective on the universe of Philosopher, a man who's trying to find the way by walking in it, and I love that.
And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah,
as if there's more than two of me, having me on the podcast.
Oh, we all contain multitudes, right? Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.